Sorry, we just had a slight technical problem there. Carl, would you mind just repeating what you just said and explaining about Chasm and the other problems you work on?
Sure. All right. So Chasm's about 8 years old. It was set up really with two main purposes. One was to kind of build technology to understand social media and the internet. We saw that as an amazing new opportunity for researchers. You know, suddenly there were all these data sets which were unbelievably rich and huge and linked and real time, and the methods and ability for researchers to actually turn it into robust insight just didn't exist. So Chasm was built to be a kind of tech lab and a methods development house. And then we also kind of obviously were in a think tank and wanted to use it to try and get a handle on and a clearer picture of all the problems that were rising up online. I mean, social media, we all now know, is a kind of tremendous agent of societal change. It changes almost everything. It changes the way that people do politics. It changes the way that people break the law. It changes the identities that people have, how they come together, how they're split apart. And so over the last 8 years or so, we've kind of, as much as possible, kind of tried to kind of do research on the problems that we thought were most important, kind of like outputs of the increasing digitization of social life. So that was everything from like terrorist exploitation of the internet through to hate crime, the kind of victimization of Muslims online, anti-Semitism online. We've done a lot around the changing nature of political participation and the way in which people use social media platforms to do politics, to become activists, to campaign. And then latterly, we've been working on, I think, one of the really most significant pivots of all, which is the kind of the growth of online influence and the way in which the manipulation and subversion of social media platforms has become a tool of geopolitics. And then, of course, issues like environmental crime online, which are kind of, I think, kind of tremendously neglected and overlooked, but which, like these other areas, are kind of changing the dynamics of how these longer standing problems actually work.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thanks, Carl. Also on the show, we have Roxanne Joseph, a data journalist and associate of the Oxpecker Center for Investigative Environmental Journalism, who's going to be talking about the challenges and opportunities for journalists to tackle this problem, as well as introducing the Media Matters map. Roxanne, where is Oxpecker's based? And can you tell us some of the data or environmental or data and environmental projects you've worked on?
Hi, Simon. I'm Carl. Thanks for having me on the show, and good morning, good afternoon. So Oxpeckers is an NPO based in Southern Africa, which uses investigative data and geomapping tools to promote and advance environmental journalism all throughout Africa. And early last year, we started working on digitally enabled or online illegal wildlife trade, whichever you prefer to call it. When we looked at how the South African-based marketplace has become the largest in Africa, and what we did was conduct a small-scale investigation focusing on the impact that increased internet access has on pangolins, rhinos, leopards, and sun gazer lizards, which are endemic to sub-Saharan Africa. All of these species are, of course, endangered. We have also partnered with the Earth Journalism Network to create a mapping tool called #WildEye, is the full name, which is used to track seizures, arrests, court cases, and convictions across Europe. And the tool is part of a broader project that aids journalists monitoring and investigating illegal wildlife trade. So two of the stories that have come out of that project so far looked at an organized transnational crime ring that was smuggling tiger parts from the heart of the EU from, I think, the Czech Republic, and another that looked at how wildlife traffickers use mail delivery services, especially during high seasons like Christmas, for example, as well as the internet and the dark web to smuggle their contraband. At the moment, we're working on a bigger transnational investigation that links African, European, and Asian markets through the eyes of online illegal wildlife trade. And here we're looking at the technical aspects of it and trying to understand exactly how it works. We've obviously been working with the global initiative throughout all of this. And as we'll speak about later, this led to the creation of the Media Matters map.
Okay, thanks, Roxanne. You mentioned the dark web, and I find often when I raise this topic, people immediately assume that that's what we're talking about mainly. It's people hiding in the darkest corners of the internet that are selling, entire rhino horns. Could you talk a little bit about whether that's the case? How much of a role does the dark web play?
Well, surprisingly, to my surprise, at least, I think I was one of those people that fall into that category. It's actually, sadly, so easy to get away with this that often people don't have to turn to the dark web. And at least at the moment, there isn't much, if any, of this type of activity going on kind of that deep online. What I've seen, and the kind of research that I've read around this, is that it happens on, first of all, a surface level, which is the kind of internet that anyone can access without a password, without any kind of special technology on any browser. That's normally where people are advertising very, very brazenly, might I add. And having conversations and building communities around illegal wildlife trade. The actual trade itself doesn't really take place there. It's not like you've got some guy commenting, okay, cool, transfer the money to this account and you'll get it at this address. That takes place kind of one level below that on the deep web, which is still a part of the internet that anyone can access. It's just closed. So you often need a password or special type of software. And these are places like closed Facebook groups, WhatsApp chats, or WeChat, which is quite big in the Asian market. And that's where you'll have people sending you things like price lists and talking about the actual facilitation of how the deal is going to take place.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. So this channel has been set up for the global initiative to talk about research that we're working on, research that's about to come out. Today we're going to be talking about two aspects of the Digital Dangers Project, which was set up to develop more of an evidence base around online trade, understand its dynamics, and very crucially to look into how we could disrupt it. And as part of that, we worked closely with Carl and his engineers to develop this tool, the DDDE, Dynamic Data Discovery Engine, that we're going to be talking about. And we also supported many journalists, and we're going to be talking about a tool that really just showcases that work. What do these tools have in common? Well, tools encapsulate two sides of an issue, the problem and a proposed solution to the problem. In this case, the problem is a wickedly complex, highly faceted problem of the illegal wildlife trade and what it means that the internet is increasingly being used to feed demand for that trade, either through marketing or through providing a space for transactions to take place or to be initiated, as Roxanne has explained. In short, the problem is that you can buy ivory on eBay, or you can buy a highly endangered Indian star tortoise on Facebook, or that you can be provoked into a frenzy of botanical envy by a relatively obscure forum to seek out a wild collected orchid to buy. And like never before, a desire that someone has on one side of the world can be connected to or preempted by a middleman who makes a series of acts, and that means that in one of the small slivers of the planet still dedicated to wild nature, a creature or plant can be caught or killed or harvested. And sometimes the supply lines between that origin and the place where the demand occurs are controlled by serious organized crime. We see that particularly with high-value products like ivory and rhino horn. And often they're only controlled by sort of organized, arguably serious crime. Sometimes smuggling is almost entirely conducted by enthusiasts who know that they can get away with it or who wouldn't even really consider themselves lawbreakers. These supply lines almost always involve corruption at some point. And by the time products reach market, consumers may be totally unaware, willfully or not, that their purchases have come to them the way they have. In the last 20 years or so, the internet has become a powerful part of that story in two respects, transactions and marketing. In countries where there's the most potential for demand for illegal wildlife products to grow, there's also growing internet use and growing online commerce. So we really see this problem as one that has a lot of space to expand and to become more serious. And if we're going to take consumer markets and demand side questions seriously, then the internet can't be ignored. And the problem is, from a legal and law enforcement perspective, it's very hard to do anything about the issue. Jurisdiction is a major problem for cybercrime of all types, and online illegal wildlife trade is very far down the agenda of the small amount of law enforcement resources that are dedicated towards cybercrime. Carl, this is something that you've written about in respect of other online crimes. Could you talk a little bit about the broader context for these challenges? And what does this issue, the issue of illegal wildlife trade online, have in common with other problems of the digital age?
Yes, a fantastic question. I mean, so the broadest context for this is that we're living through, in my opinion, probably the greatest crisis of law enforcement in the history of modern policing. Half of crime happens online now, and it's been growing for probably the last 10 years, really without us being able to measure it. Online fraud is the most common crime happening in the UK. You're 80 times more likely to have your social media accounts burgled than your house. You're more likely to receive a virus than be the victim of all forms of violent crime put together. So we've been living through like a pivotal, fundamental, massively significant change in where and how crime happens. And as it happens online, it takes on a characteristic which makes it unbelievably difficult for law enforcement agencies to spot. And that isn't actually to do with technology. It's not to do with skills. It's simply to do with geography. Crime online, whether it's the illegal wildlife trade or whether it's selling guns or whether it's committing harassment or threats, all of it basically passes unbelievably easily across borders. And the one thing that doesn't is law enforcement. So in investigation after investigation, I spent time with cybercrime teams. You kind of see the same thing happening, which is that they kind of find the perpetrators in one country, they find the victims in a second, they find the evidence scattered in a third, fourth, and fifth country. Sometimes on the data, within the data sets of tech giants in other countries, sometimes elsewhere. And they simply cannot reach across those borders and bring them all into a single place and put that into a courtroom. So in the kind of gap which law enforcement agencies, I think, have left, we've kind of pushed other kinds of actors in to try and kind of enforce the rules and the norms and the laws that we have for us. And foremost amongst them have been the tech giants themselves. We've gone through a kind of long process of what I would call kind of reform through political and media embarrassment, as tech giants have been kind of embarrassed that they're hosting terrorist content, or they're hosting child sexual exploitation content, or they're hosting hate speech. And they've kind of began to implement in all of these different areas various kinds of techniques, mitigation techniques, policy changes, tweaks to the way their platform works in order to try and reduce the amount of activity across those different problem areas which are actually happening. That's kind of created the internet which we have today, which I would say first and foremost is an internet which which is split between the parts of it which have a business model and can be embarrassed, and the parts of it which don't. So the first kind of split is that we see Facebook and Twitter and to some extent YouTube and others kind of having some form of mitigation. So they're trying to do something to try and sort some of these problems out. But then we have all these forums, we have the specialist sites, we have the discussion sites, and we've obviously got dark social, as it's now called, these sites which require either membership or password to access, which really don't deploy those kind of mitigation techniques at all. So it's a very, very kind of speckled jurisdictional space where you've both got some laws and some guidelines and some policies being enforced in some areas and certainly not others. And kind of the first, obviously what you described about, online environmental crime spanning all these different areas is really like just one of lots of different phenomena which kind of exploit these cracks, which, will begin with promoting in a high visibility space like Facebook, and then draw the discussion into other channels which are less visible and less policed. And the kind of second, I suppose the kind of second kind of big split is because the main way in which this has happened, the main way in which enforcement has been rolled out is primarily due to reputational considerations. We've got a massively uneven kind of emphasis on certain kinds of problems, not others. So when an issue becomes basically so embarrassing, especially within the markets and within the politics of nations which can hurt tech giants, which can regulate tech giants, then that's where you see the activity. So we're seeing more and more, for instance, right now on Russian exploitation of social media platforms, because that's become a kind of principal and primary kind of preoccupation and worry for US and Western European governments. What that means is that lots of things fall through the gaps. We're always going to have more problems than we can talk about. And so some issue areas, and I would argue that online environmental crime, at least to me, is the most important of them, simply don't have the same visibility yet. They don't have the same political oxygen. Therefore, the tech giants are not being even nearly as embarrassed in not doing as much about them, which means there's much less activity. And then secondly, there's a very kind of uneven rollout in terms of the languages and the geographies where this kind of enforcement happens. So outside of the English language, if you go to Central Europe, you go to Asia, then the kind of enforcement which you see happening in English speaking and Western European and American kind of markets constituencies, well, that a lot of that begins to dissolve quite quickly. So, really like what I think we're dealing with is, of course, an internet which is in essence and technically speaking very, very connected indeed. It's very easy for people to move between channels. It's very easy for people to find stuff, even if it's being hosted and spoken about on the other side of the world. But from a jurisdictional point of view, from a law enforcement point of view, it's actually still online, kind of representing all the different geographical fissures, politically, reputationally speaking, which we see offline as well. So it's a very, very kind of bundled space where there's lots of different kinds of rules, policies, and levels of effort all being employed all at once.
Thanks, that's very interesting. I think it speaks a little bit to what we're going to talk about in terms of what is the role of public awareness of the kind of work that journalists do to expose what companies are doing, to make consumers aware of what markets they're participating in. Roxanne, you've approached the issue as a data journalist. And what are some of the reasons that it's hard to work on from the perspective of someone in civil society who's trying to address this problem?
Well, funnily enough, the issues are actually pretty similar to what Carl described, just, through the eyes of someone who's trying to create a workable data set to give context to the types of stories that we're trying to do. So, as he said, the internet is a huge, ever-evolving marketplace where you can get pretty much anything you want 24/7. So it's almost impossible to narrow that down to even a handful of places on the internet to focus on and find your data. And while narrowing down the issue and tackling each incident one by one would be the ideal, And that is what a lot of organizations and law enforcement obviously do. The problem is that the minute an ad or a comment, or something like that is reported or deleted in one place online, it just pops up in a dozen other places. And so the cycle continues. And again, it's impossible to follow and find all of that. There's no easy way of monitoring and then compiling a clean, ready-to-use data set. So all of the work that we've done at Oxpeckers up until now has been entirely manual. We rely on things like press releases, social media, and news reports for this type of information, which we then turn into a data set and, eventually into a story. Carl also mentioned the language barrier. So now, not only do you need to know exactly where to look, which obviously differs from country to country, just because one website is quite popular here in South Africa, it probably isn't even known in a place like Russia. But you also need to have an extensive list of keywords in all of the languages where you're actually looking and reporting on. So you can see that it's a monumental task that can't easily be done, especially when you have such a small team and without some kind of technical assistance. The last issue that we really face is that you need to understand the laws and regulations of pretty much every country in the world. As we've been speaking about, these crimes cross borders all the time. So, for example, it's legal to trade rhino horns within South Africa if you have the right permits to move them from one province to the other, but that can quickly become illegal the minute it leaves the country. Similar to the EU or the individual countries within the EU aren't the members of CITES. It's the EU, the whole body in its entirety. So if you can get something into the area, you can move it around pretty easily because you don't need separate permits. And again, this makes tracking down this type of data and producing these kind of stories even more difficult. And it makes assessing the size, scale, and impact, I won't say virtually, but almost impossible as a data journalist. And at the moment, all we can really do is to hyper-focus and write about specific incidents to draw attention to the issue with whatever data we can get our hands on and create.
Okay, thanks. It's certainly thorny problem to start exploring. Carl, we came to you at the beginning of the Digital Dangers Project and asked you to help us figure out how to measure this phenomenon. And you, at that point, were very optimistic that it could be done almost in its entirety. Can you tell us a bit about how that didn't pan out? Yeah.
Yes, of course. So yes, the kind of problem was a common one again to kind of online research, which is essentially this. There's a phenomenon that you're interested in trying to measure. You want to know how much of it happens, and you want to know where it happens. And you can have access to various kinds of data sets on some social media platforms, but it's very hard to know where that actually is all spread across all of the internet. And that is a common problem for digital researchers, whether you're trying to look at the environmental online trade or whether you're trying to look at, say, the process of radicalization. It's a problem which researchers have struggled with for quite some time. The kind of approach that we had eventually became the kind of dynamic data discovery engine. There wasn't a kind of solution or tool we thought that already existed. So we needed to do what Chasm frequently does. It's an important part of our work, and kind of trial and pilot different methodological attempts and new technologies to see what we could do to try and build something which could find environmental crime or suspected environmental crime in as comprehensive and broad a way as possible. Now, I don't know if you want me to talk about the method now, but in terms of how that all panned out, probably kind of two things became pretty apparent to us as we worked through different case studies, and we spent essentially a year kind of building and trying to solve this problem. First was that we could gather lots and lots of data, which we knew somewhere in there was online environmental crime. So in one sense, I think we were able to expand the amount of detection that we could do beyond individual case studies, beyond looking at single platforms, and spot across a much broader array of different online sources, places which were much more likely to be conducting online environmental crime. But then there were some big stumbling blocks as well. Firstly, perhaps most difficult to us was we simply couldn't build something which was universally able to do this for all environmental crime online. So we kind of began to kind of reset our ambitions to focus more on individual species and individual instances and phenomena, and ended up with 3 pilots looking at 3 different kinds of thing which were being trafficked online in an illicit way. And then secondly, what we're currently working on is how to actually produce outputs which are clean enough and accurate enough for end users, be they either journalists or governments or anyone else, to actually use. Again, this is a common problem with digital research, in that you get data back which is very messy. It's inherently based on probabilities. That's the way that machine learning and natural language processing, to the key technologies we use throughout this whole project, the way they work. But what you get back is data sets which are messy and too large to be able to be manually read. So there is another problem where you are then trying to do a kind of like data cleaning and relevancy exercise, trying to further reduce the outputs down to kind of manageable sub buckets. Ones which are clean enough to actually put in front of a human analyst to allow them to be able to kind of gain insight directly from the data. And again, whether you're looking at online environmental crime or you're looking at, say, online influence on social media platforms, like quite often you are always confronted with this problem, which we simply didn't have as social researchers, social scientists, before we started researching the internet, this problem of just overwhelming amounts of data.
Okay, that's really interesting. So the tool has this phenomenal power to look in places that it kind of discovers along the way. A lot of the studies that I see on this topic, people isolate a platform and they search for all of a particular species or a range of species, say reptiles, on Facebook or on eBay. Whereas this tool is kind of following language around the internet and finding this data in places that the researcher, perhaps sort of setting it off on its journey, didn't know it would find that data in. Is that correct?
That's right, and it's actually a really, really difficult kind of technology and research task. So it's about discovery. Now, discovery for a researcher is much harder than kind of confirmation. And normally the way in which you collect data from platforms is to kind of ask those platforms for the kind of data that you want back. So, you ask Twitter to send back all tweets which contain certain kinds of words, certain keywords or phrases which you've kind of already somehow managed to identify as to be relevant to your study. Now, that can act as a kind of confirmation of analysts' suspicions or beliefs or hunches in a certain area, but isn't necessarily that useful in allowing kind of researchers to actually discover new aspects of the phenomenon. So there were a number of different design principles which we tried to kind of bake into the discovery engine. Probably 2 were most important here for discovery. One was that the platform needed to be the process needed to be platform agnostic. So we didn't want to kind of force analysts to already predetermine the places where online environmental crime happened, because we knew that there were probably lots of forums, and potentially the most pernicious ones, which the analysts actually hadn't heard of beforehand and needed to know existed. So we needed to build something which could span across a number of different forums and online places and venues in order to collect data. That was design principle number one. And secondly, we needed to make it kind of dynamic. We understand this phenomenon to be one which is evolving quickly. The language continues to change, the things that continue to change as a marketplace, so incentives and supply and demand dynamics will constantly change as well. So there's no point just creating a process which offers a single and then rapidly aging snapshot. You need something which can actually follow the phenomena as those phenomena themselves change. So in a nutshell, we built a kind of process which is probably best understood as being a kind of dynamic loop. So it kind of learns from itself. That's the idea. So you know, you begin with some sites where you know the phenomenon is happening. It eventually produces many more sites which are linguistically similar to those same sites. You then identify the relevant ones within there, and they become the kind of input of the next kind of cascade of the process. And the kind of hope is that as these kind of outputs become inputs, as it were, the kind of whole process kind of is able to both identify new platforms and new forms of language, which are part of the kind of way in which the phenomena itself might evolve and change. So it can kind of over time kind of track kind of the significant kind of pivots in how people, behaviorally speaking, how people are actually using the internet to illicitly trade wildlife, in ways which basically come out in the data which analysts can track. That was at least the idea.
Okay, that's super interesting. I've obviously talked to you about it a lot along the way. I know the first time that I heard it explained, it didn't all cohere for me. If you also need to go through what the procedures are a bit more slowly, or want to look at it in a bit more detail, Carl and his team did actually write up this process in a report that is available on the Digital Dangers landing page, which is on the Global Initiative website. So you can download that and look at it in more detail. Roxanne, you talked about how at the moment you're going through data in a very manual way. What kind of potential does the type of tool that Carl is talking about hold for you as someone who is potentially that end user that can do the more expert informed sort of sifting through that data?
Well, I think it's going to change everything about how I do the kind of work that I do, and you know, same goes for my colleagues doing this type of work. The biggest problem for me, and I think Carl mentioned this earlier, is how much information we're missing out on. And it's all good and well and essential to, you know, narrow it down and tell very specific stories about specific areas, about specific species, and the communities and the ecosystems that those impact. But without being able to provide a deeper context and understanding and a fuller picture, you know, it makes it really difficult for your readers or your viewers or your listeners to truly understand how bad the problem is. And for me, ever since I started doing this kind of work, a lot of people's responses to me are, you know, now you're even more of an activist, you know, than you were before. Is this still really journalism? Because people don't view it as serious a crime as they do something like human trafficking or arms dealing or, you know, drug trafficking. But we know that it is that bad, or, you know, in some cases it's even worse, and in other cases it comes hand in hand with those things. So being able to provide a fuller picture and catch incidents that we were definitely missing out on before is going to just allow for better journalism. and therefore, a better informed public and increased public awareness, which is really what we need. Because, again, it's great that governments are talking about this more, politicians, activists, NGOs. It's being written more about and reported on more about in the media, but we need the public's buy-in for real change, for real long-term change to actually happen. So this completely changes everything. And I'm really excited to be able to use something like this in the future and have access to this kind of data. It also just saves a lot of time. I spoke about how difficult it is to do something like this on such a small team. Even the biggest newsrooms around the world have data journalism teams of 2, 3, maybe 4 people. It's not enough to catch everything that's out there.
Okay, thanks. That's very interesting. If we could move on to a related topic, today we're launching a map. It's embedded on our website. It's been put together with oxpeckers. We call it the Media Matters map, and it's premised on this idea that across the GI's work, in fact, that journalism is hugely important, both for exposing what's going on, for drawing attention to issues that are neglected, and for educating the public. And this particular map focuses on journalism we've supported in connection to environmental crime. At the moment, a lot of it is linked to our Digital Dangers project, so it has quite a big focus on online markets, but it's something that we're going to continue developing and continuing adding stories to. So it will, over time, look at an even more diverse range of environmental crime journalism. And we support journalism in a number of ways. Sometimes we're giving grants to journalists so they can take the time and do the research, covering expenses so that they can travel to places that they need to. We often work with the Thomson Reuters Foundation and provide training, particularly in investigative methods, and also mentoring. And with this map, we wanted to have a place where that work was pulled together and people could come to it to see quite a diverse range of environmental crime journalists. A lot of our, almost all of our grant work is given to journalists in developing countries and in various parts of the world. Roxanne, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about some of the stories that are mapped at the moment.
So the map is divided into different types of stories, which include the pet trade, online markets, medicinal or spiritual, illicit financial flow, and corruption. And the stories, there's a wide range of stories. They range from things like focusing on specific countries. So there are stories about online illegal wildlife trade in Nigeria, Brazil, and Pakistan, for example, to using methods like WhatsApp to buy and sell trafficked animals. Another one looks at how the UAE has become a hugely popular destination for the more exotic animals as pets, like otters, tigers, and certain types of reptiles. As well as some of the interventions that are being looked at. They've also looked at, as we spoke about earlier, how the dark web isn't at the moment a major hub for this type of trade. And for me, it just shows how easy it is to get away with it. And I think that what these stories really show, as different and diverse as they are, they have a couple of things in common, which points directly to the problems that we have with kind of detecting and disrupting this type of illicit activity. These include the capacity to do this type of work as law enforcement is low in most countries. It's also really new to a lot of parts in the world, not all, but most. And quite honestly, our laws haven't really caught up to what's happening online. So for me, the solutions are also included in these stories. So, as you said in the beginning, it's not all doom and gloom. And the solutions are things like needing increased capacity within law enforcement, better understanding and training, better tech or tech at all. We also need to be writing about it more as journalists. And hopefully all of this and having a tool, having one place where these problems are discussed, where these solutions are hinted at or looked at more in depth, will impact our lawmakers and in the long run, hopefully change legislation and regulations around this.
Okay. And is there anything different or maybe particularly hard or particularly exciting about investigating online markets that you've seen in your own experience or that you can see in the stories that are mapped on the Media Matters map?
I think that something I would say is both really difficult and exciting, and this is going to be very nerdy, but is actually being able to create a workable data set. You get to compile a bunch of information that exists in a space that we use every day, all day, for most parts of our lives, but I think don't truly understand the depth of it. And you need a wide range of skills, many of which, for me, I've had to learn along the way to make this happen. And I think that something that all of these stories have in common, and at least within kind of my circle of journalists doing this type of work, we often talk about how difficult it is to see firsthand the impact that illegal wildlife trade, especially the type that takes place at some point online, has on animals and ecosystems. It's worse than any pet store or any kind of selling on the side of the road that I've ever seen. These animals are traumatized, often physically damaged, and there's little to no hope of them ever leaving the facilities who take them in and rehabilitate them. And that's devastating, and that's not something that a lot of people consider. And I think as a journalist, something that's very exciting for me is to be able to see the amounts of collaborative and innovative journalism that's coming out of this type of work. And again, it's so amazing to be able to see it all in one place and to be able to compare, because you'll find, while it's different from country to country, there are sadly a lot of similarities, and it didn't take me very long to realize how universal the issue is, which in one way makes working with journalists from around the world a lot easier and a lot more impactful. And collaborative journalism certainly is on the rise, and I think that this is a way in which it can really, be brought into the light and be practiced more.
Okay, thanks very much. Before we go into Q&A questions, a closing question for both of you. Maybe starting with you, Carl, what's on your wish list in terms of major shifts you'd like to see happen so that we have a better chance of making a difference on these issues?
Oh God, I mean, my wish list is long and growing longer all the time. So just to echo Roxanne briefly, I mean, journalism is I think like often the only tool that we have to force both corporate and political change to begin to get on top of these problems. One of the enormous kind of troubling trends is that at the same time as the digital world has risen, at the same time all these new problems have emerged, at the same time as law enforcement agencies around the world have began to face these new difficulties and our legal and regulatory frameworks have been disrupted in such a profound way, it's also exactly the same moment that journalism as a commercial undertaking, and this is around the world and in the West as well, has itself been tremendously undermined. I mean, we've seen more and more readerships move online. The amount of money that is actually made by newsrooms and newspapers around the world has decreased drastically. The amount of time that journalists can actually spend doing the one thing which we really need journalists to do, which is the kind of gritty details orientated, time consuming task of kind of investigating kind of the mendacious and the corrupt is declining all the time. I see it happening all the time. Local newspapers in the UK, I mean, we've lost 180 over the last 6 years, and we've lost a third of the journalists we have over the last 10. So I think, like, if I was to kind of find one of the many different kind of wishes that I have to go first, it would be that we support and we find ways of invigorating journalists and journalism, find ways of being able to fund journalists to spend the time that they need in order to investigate and break the stories that they need to break. And of course, and this speaks to the, you know, all the work we're talking about now, find ways of journalism, like every other industry and trade, kind of pivoting towards online spaces in order to do it, the new skills and technologies and techniques which are needed by them in order to kind of do the kind of investigations online that they've been so important in doing offline for so long.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Roxanne, seeing as Carl's punted for journalism, what's on your wish list?
Thanks for the support, Carl. I think for me, you know, aside from that probably would have been the obvious answer. I would really like to see tech companies and platforms come to the party and help. I think, you know, we can write about it, NGOs can report on it, all of the research in the world can be done on it, but the fact that this is being allowed in the first place, to me, is completely unacceptable. And, you know, I think we all know who the major culprits are. As great as social media is, it just makes it so easy to get away with this kind of behavior. And I think that these companies and these platforms just need to be better and stop allowing this kind of thing to happen.
Okay, thanks very much. I have a few questions, so we can see how many of them we get through. First of all, from Philip Hendon. I read a study on dark web markets for drugs that showed that cyber distribution only happened at the very end of the supply chain. So it was the last step between consumer and seller. So in the places and communities where drugs were produced and sourced weren't involved in the online markets. Do you know if this is the same for environmental markets? And if this is true, isn't the problem with environmental commodities that once they reach the point of sale, the damage has already been done? The species ripped from their habitats or killed? Shouldn't we be looking for interventions that are earlier in the supply chain that prevent the damage being done in the first place? Okay, that's Philip. Skeptical that we should be looking at online markets. I think that's a very good question. I'll provide a few answers. Philip's right in that online markets are looking at the end, mostly, of these supply chains. There has been a very interesting study on grey parrots from Central Africa being poached en masse in the DRC, where there were middlemen who were connecting via Facebook between Kinshasa and markets in Pakistan. But in general, you know, this is going to the end consumer. We actually find that a lot of online markets, most of them, are targeting people within their own countries. So the goods have come through very complex international routes crossing lots of borders, but often by the time it's on a Facebook group, that Facebook group will be catering primarily to people within the same city where the animals can be delivered, you know, in the case of the live animal or pet trade, by couriers. However, there are currently many interventions that try to target locations of origin. So one of the biggest trends within the response to wildlife crime over the last decade has been the militarization of game parks in southern Africa and other parts of Africa to protect rhinos and elephants primarily. So there's already a huge focus on those types of interventions, yet we haven't seen them decrease demand or decrease the size of the markets in some cases, though there have been successes in reducing the number of animals poached. It's often come at the cost of criminalizing the communities that live near the game parks in ways that are really reminiscent of the war on drugs, where people who are participating in poaching for reasons of subsistence get trapped in cycles of criminalization, going to jail, coming out, not being able to get jobs, etc. And one of the insights that we have from other commodities is that interventions need to work at all parts of the chain. They need to consider all questions, including around regulation and whether banning things or having different types of regulation is the right approach. We think, and it's really an emerging trend within organizations that are working on this issue to consider questions of behavior change and demand reduction. And that focusing on online markets allows one to better understand how to do those interventions, to better understand how consumers interact with the markets, and also yields very important information about what's happening along the rest of the supply chain. I have another question which I'm going to throw out to Carl and Roxanne in our last few minutes. Fantastic insights. This is from Tuesday Reitano. Thank you to all the presenters. I would like to understand how civil society, academia, researchers can work together to strengthen law enforcement interventions. Or are you proposing that we enable everyone to be investigators, activists, and start advocating for change? Carl, what's your response to that?
It's a very good question. I mean, really, eventually, law enforcement agencies have to be the actors to step in to begin to enforce the law online as they do offline. But we are currently so far away from that happening. There is kind of an absolute kind of jurisdictional quagmire where it's massively unclear to everyone, like who takes responsibility for policing a lot of the activity which we're seeing, and where it's kind of like conversely trivially easy, of course, for bad actors to kind of shift their activity in various ways online to mean that they can conduct their activity in jurisdictions which don't have the same level of enforcement even than the places that have some. So right now, like what I see is us still in the kind of awareness raising kind of public advocacy stage, and that really will require, I think, kind of teched up, well funded, kind of data savvy kind of journalists and researchers using a series of increasingly well understood open sourced tools in transparent ways to become much louder about these kinds of problems. I think that's the first step, and that is really about kind of pulling together kind of interested networks, and really like what's most difficult, actually, just to conclude on this thought, or what's most necessary, is that there really are a lot of different skills which you need to bring together into a network in order to do this kind of stuff. You know, there's tech development, kind of like organizations like my own are really very different from investigative journalistic kind of newsrooms, and kind of like the kind of big thing that I think it has to kind of creep out are kind of more stable, longer term networks, like strategic networks, which can bring all those skills and capabilities into a place to allow kind of long-term collaborations to begin to get like much louder about this kind of stuff in a really kind of data-driven and powerful way, which hopefully can then begin to either really provide the kind of requisite embarrassment that the tech giants need in order to, it seems, do anything, or to push kind of law enforcement agencies to kind of build capabilities and become much more active in this area. But they're down the line. The first thing that we need to do is get much louder, and that means bringing lots of skills together.
Okay, brilliant. Roxanne, is there anything you'd like to add on that question, or anything else we've discussed in the last hour?
I think just to say that everyone has a very different role to play, and to echo Carl's words, while I don't think that we should be downplaying the role that law enforcement has, we're just so far away from being able to leave it in their hands solely. And I think what the public can do, most importantly, is read, share, and be willing to properly understand and talk about it. Not enough people are talking about it. I'm still shocked when I speak about this with someone and it is the first time that they've ever heard of this as a problem. And to me, because of how big and scary and vast the internet is, isn't it obvious that this kind of thing is happening on these types of platforms? So I think that the problem is so bad, we can and should all be contributing, and we should be combining our skills and working together to fight against this.
Okay, thanks Roxanne, thanks Carl. It's been fascinating chatting with you both, as always. I think we've had a great conversation. I'm going to wrap up now. We're at 3:00. Just to remind everyone that this is the first episode of the GI launching station. We will be having more podcasts in the future. We have lots of fascinating work going on. We have people writing about sand mafias in India and illicit gold mining in Central African Republic. We have people looking at all different acute, important questions around the drug trade and how we regulate it, and also the resilience of local communities. So we're brimming with lots of fascinating content and research that we want to get out there, and this channel is going to be one of the ways that we do it. So yeah, thank you for everyone who listened and everyone who's going to listen in the future, and thank you, Carl and Roxanne.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for having us on.